Billy Graham was being interviewed by Larry King on a show that was called Larry King Alive. And Billy, at one dramatic moment, he was very dramatic, he turned to Larry, who was a practicing Jew, I always thought that was interesting, and said, "Larry, I'm going to heaven." And then after a dramatic pause, he looked at Larry and said, "And so are you." And Larry King didn't even believe in Jesus Christ. He had a different religion. But people hear these stories from the time they're babies wearing diapers, and they just presume it's true. I remember there was a time when my mother died. We were at the funeral home, and I had a relative. She was something of a niece to me. Now, my mother loved this young girl, and I understand that. She was a very interesting young girl. She had a curious mind and a kind heart. And I think she was trying to comfort me. I think she was about junior high age when this happened. And she came to me, I think she was trying to be comforting. And she said, well, they always called her Mother. My mother was called Mother by the grandchildren. And she said, Mother's up in heaven. And someday Granddaddy will be up there in heaven with her. Now, it sort of put me on the spot. I didn't want to agree with her because I knew that was a lie. I didn't even want her to think that I agreed with it. But I didn't want to stomp her feelings. I didn't want to give her a lecture. She was too young for me to give her a lecture. And I just said nothing. And my silence made her uncomfortable, because she was expecting me, I think, well, yes, my mother's up in heaven, and soon her husband someday soon will be up there with her, and someday I will see them again in heaven. Well, you know, I spoke at my mother's funeral. I spoke at my father's funeral. And I told the people in the crowd, very forcefully, very dramatically. I remember saying, pointing over to the casket, saying, see that lady over there in the casket? And I looked down at my father and I said, Dad, I promise you, from the promises of the Bible, from the Word of God, I promise you that you will see your wife again. And then, when I was speaking at my father's funeral a few years later, I told the crowd, I know that I will see my father again. And I know that I will see my mother again. But I did not tell them I'm going to see them up in heaven, because that would have been the easy thing to do, but it would have been a lie. And I didn't want a theological lie coming out of my mouth at such a solemn and sacred time as the funerals for these two people. And they were separated by a few years. And I think I even said, someday I will see them once again on the earth. And that shocked a lot of people. Oh, and I even said before I started that, I said, you know, there's probably 200 people in this room today. And if every one of you had a chance to come up here behind the microphone, we might hear 200 different ideas about what will happen to my mother and or my father at some future time. But the one thing they never expected to hear was for me to tell them, I will see my mother, then later on, I will see my father on the earth, and he will live again. Well, that was quite an event. I would advise most of you not to speak at the funeral of your parents or a loved one, because it's not easy to do. You're up there, everybody's looking at you. The casket's just a few feet away. Down before you, stretched out on the left, on the right, are all of these family members. They're looking to you for some type of comfort or reassurance or peace. Now, the only peace I know to give them, that I only knew to give them, was the truth of the Bible. But those words were basically foreign to them. Foreign to them. They had never heard the things that I was saying. Now, folks, I'll tell you, I hope I am alive when Jesus Christ returns, which means he needs to get about the task, because I don't know how many more years I have in my life. As I've said before, I hope I have 10 years in my life, and maybe if I'm fortunate and blessed, maybe I can squeak out another 15 years of my life. But I've often wondered, if I were to die before Jesus Christ returns, who will speak at my funeral? And what will they say? Will they find some Methodist preacher and have him haul around on things he doesn't even really know? I hope not. But I do not have a relative that knows the truth of God. I hope that someone that I know who does indeed know and understand the truth of God can somehow find out and be there to speak on my behalf and to tell the crowd what I would want them to know, that what I believe. Now that reminds me of a story. Quite a few years ago, it might be 15 years ago now, there was a man whom I sort of got to know vicariously. I didn't know him very well, but I knew two other people that knew him. And this man's wife, unfortunately, had died. And I got a telephone call saying that Mr. Such and Such wanted me to come down to Arkansas and to speak at his wife's funeral. I think it was going to be held on a Sunday. And so on a late Saturday afternoon, I drove down to the Evansville airport, about 45 minutes away, ended up getting onto a plane and flying down to Little Rock, Arkansas. And there, somebody that I knew came and picked me up, drove me down to this area of Arkansas. And the following day, I spoke at the funeral. And the funeral was in an old school building. It was no longer a school, but the school auditorium, which had always been there, was still existing. There was a stage. I'm sure many presentations had been done from that stage, probably plays, maybe singing groups, a chorus, a choir. And they had the theater seating where it started low and it gradually built up higher as you went farther back, so everyone had a good view. And I got up on that stage, and I was told by the widow, I was told by the woman's husband the night before, he grabbed me by the shoulder very intensely and said, "Mike, I want you to tell those people the truth of God. Now don't go easy on them. Don't get mushy on me. Don't tell them some fantasy, some story. Tell them the truth as stated in the Bible." I thought, okay. Now when you think about it, funerals are not really so much for the dead because they can't hear you. But funerals are meant for the living, for the family members, the friends, the loved ones, associated people. And this widow wanted the people to hear the truth of God. And so I honored his request. I spoke the truth of God. Now I said it as tactfully as I knew how to say it, with as much kindness and empathy and love as I knew how to say it. But for one person in the room, he did not appreciate what I had to say. He was a man, I can see his face right now, I'm guessing he was around 40 years of age. And he was sitting where basically we were at eye level. So I was up on the stage, and he was sitting about a third of the way back. So we were basically the same elevation. And the more I spoke, the more angry he became. I mean, you could see his face turning red, the expression, you could see his fist clench, his body movement. And I said to myself, Michael, it is possible that that idiot could come charging up here on this stage, and you may have to knock him out. He's not far from just charging you and wanting to hit you or beat you up. I thought, well, buddy, I don't think that's what you want to do, because I'll defend myself and I won't be gentle with you. But I was prepared. And later on, when the funeral finally ended, when I finally stopped speaking, whoosh, he flew out the side door, just in a big huff. He was pissed off, and he wanted everybody to know that he was highly upset. And it was duly noted. And so later on, I asked somebody that knew of that crowd, I said, what's the story of the fella that flew out of here? I said, what's his game? What's his story? And they told me that just maybe 2 or 3 years before, a short time, it wasn't like 20 years before, he tragically had a son, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years of age, who died. And that man had comforted himself all of this time by reminding himself that he would see his son up in heaven, that his boy was up in heaven right now. And that's how he mollified his hurt and his pain and his grief. And I took that great hope that he had, and I just wadded it up and threw it in the trash can. Well, the fella shouldn't have been mad at me. He should have been mad at the pastor, the preacher, or the priest that had taught him that Mickey Mouse story, that fantasy that he had believed all these years. Now, someday that fella will come to understand that I was telling him the genuine, true truth of God. But right at that time, he wasn't able to handle it. It's like that old Jack Nicholson scene in that movie, took place at Gitmo, security guard, something, I forget the plot. And Jack Nicholson is on trial. I think, I can see his face. He became famous in the movies about Top Gun. And he was the lawyer prosecuting. And he finally, Jack Nicholson lost his temper and said, "You can't handle the truth." Well, most people cannot handle the truth. I have people that I know. One in particular is extremely near and dear to me. And I dare say, if circumstances presented themselves to me, I would be willing to die for this person. That's how highly I think of them. And yet, apparently I am now on their shit list. Forgive my language, folks, but it's the only phrase that really captures the essence. I'm on their list now because I don't believe the things that they believe. They belong to a mainstream Protestant group. And at one time they used to watch some of these very videos. And they found out bit by bit that I don't believe that traditional garbage that you hear on a Sunday morning at some Catholic church or Protestant church. I don't believe it. And I'm not even that respectful of it, if you want to know the truth. I can't stand that garbage that they think is truth. I can't stand it because I know that it hurts people. It deceives people. It confuses people. It clouds their minds so that when you attempt to show them the truth of God from the Bible, they cannot comprehend it. We've talked about here in the last 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 videos being a chain breaker, breaking off the bonds. And one of the greatest bonds that hold us back is false religion. not understanding the truth of God, but rather believing a fairy tale. And one of the biggest areas that causes people so many problems is because of things they've heard in their church classes, their Sunday school, things they've heard around the kitchen table, things they've possibly heard relatives talk about. The truth of God, which is plain and simple. The truth of God is very simple. But in order to understand it, you have to get the garbage of your past out of your head. You must allow your mind to be fresh and clean and open to the words of the Bible. If you keep believing the crap, you can't understand the truth. It's like a garden. Instead of the garden plants growing, all the weeds grow up around it. And before long, those weeds will simply choke out the truth. Well, I don't think those people think much of me anymore. Keep in mind what I just said. I would be willing to die for one of these people. I don't think I would the other. I find him thoroughly obnoxious, conceited, arrogant, brash, pompous, conceited, highly judgmental. And he's just leaking self-righteousness from every pore of his body. Now, if he were to hear me say that, number one, he doesn't really know who I'm talking about because I haven't used his name, and I'm not going to. But he would be offended. I'm offended that you said that about me. And I would say, how do you know who I was talking about? Well, I presumed you were talking about me. Well, you're not the only one that has this horrible spiritual condition. I know several like you, if you want to know the truth. That would even make him more angry. And what was one of his favorite words? You're deflecting. Now, folks, I've gone through 76 years of life, over 3/4 of a century. And I had never heard anybody use the word deflecting or deflection. And yet, it seemed like this man was all the time trying to use that word on me. You're deflecting. You're deflecting. And I thought, oh my. The truth could come up like a pie, like a big old pumpkin pie, and hit you smack dab in the face. And even after you tasted it, you wouldn't figure out what I was talking about. Your head and your heart are just unbelievably calloused. It makes me think of what Jesus said. Maybe I should read that right now. Let me check my time. Yeah, I have time. We got to go back to the book of Matthew. Matthew 23. I will say to all of you, if you ever have to deal with somebody who thinks they are religious, if you ever have to deal with someone who thinks they know everything, I mean a high degree of arrogance, a total lack of humility. I mean, they really think they're the cat's meow. And you're frustrated by it. I'm not someone that likes to just come up and insult somebody. That's not my style. If somebody asks me a question, I try to be tactful. I try to be very delicate in how I answer their question. I try to be careful not to go out of my way to offend them, to anger them. Because if they get angry with me, they're not going to understand or hear a single word I say. And so sometimes I'll keep myself very calm. I think it's the umpire in me. Been an umpire for 62 years. And I've learned over those 62 years that most of the time it is better off if the umpire speaks softly. Now, there are times you got to crank it up and really let the coach or the player know that you mean business. But I try to be, what does the proverb say? A soft answer turns away wrath. I try to be gentle. But sometimes in dealing with some of these self-righteous jerks, let me get a quick drink of water. That tasted nice. I need my reading glasses. Let's turn to Matthew 23. Jesus Christ had a confrontation with some of the Pharisees. Now, this happened near the end of the gospel accounts. Jesus doesn't really have that much longer to live as a human being. His human existence is going to end soon. And the Pharisees, hard-headed, arrogant, conceited, judgmental, self-righteous. They love to point the finger and accuse people of this and that. And they never learned the principle that when you start pointing a finger at one person, 3 fingers are normally pointing back. It says in verse 1, "Then spoke Jesus to the multitudes and to his disciples." So he's giving one of his final sermons, as it were, one of his final verbal presentations. And he said, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." Now, if you keep in mind, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, in the days of Jesus were not direct descendants of the Levitical priesthood. the Levitical priesthood had been abolished when Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar hundreds of years before. But when the Jewish people, or many of them, came back to Jerusalem, they tried to start up the old ways. And somewhere, I call them the temple elite. They hung out at the temple, the new temple, because remember, the original temple was destroyed when Jerusalem and Judea was conquered by the Babylonians. Then time went by, and then a new temple was built, and the civilization, the culture of Jerusalem began to come back to life. And a new crop of teachers came along and presumed that they actually sat in Moses' seat. It's interesting that Jesus even mentioned the term Moses' seat. It was almost like he was saying, they're fakes. They're frauds. They aren't the original Levitical priesthood. That was started and led by Aaron, who was Moses' brother. And they were of the Levitical, or the tribe of Levi. He said, all therefore, verse 3, whatsoever they say, they bid you to observe, that observe and do, but do not after their works, for they say and they do not. Now, Jesus was being very respectful to them. I believe if you actually would have asked Jesus a question, why are you giving them as much honor as you are? Because until Jesus actually died as a human, was in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, and then was resurrected, the temple system was still in vogue. Once Jesus was resurrected from the dead, the old covenant ceased to exist. So Jesus was paying some homage to the old ways, but he was offering himself to the people as the way of the future. He said, listen to what they say, but don't do what they do. He said, for they bind heavy burdens. This is verse 4. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and they lay them on men's shoulders. Now, remember that term we've used here for the last 2, 3, 4 videos? Chain breaker. Being able to break away from the bondage. The Pharisees were presenting to the people, and they claimed that they were the spiritual leaders, a set of ideas that were in effect bondage. Now again, this is Matthew 23. And Jesus isn't going to be around for much longer. But he says something very clearly. Do not after their works, for they say, and yet they do not. I think that's what you call a hypocrite. I think if you look that up in the dictionary, that's the definition you would get. He says, verse 4 again, to read it again, for they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne. They lay them upon men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. They won't even lift the slightest little weight. Verse 5, but now get this. Does this sound familiar? Think about it. For all their works they do to be seen of men. Now here, a few days ago, in the middle of the week, I had a conversation with my physical therapist. Now let me state, I like my physical therapist. I'm just going to call him Fred right now. We'll just call him Fred. That's not his actual name. And Fred is an intelligent man. I have no doubt about it. But Fred is deeply immersed into the theology of a certain major church group. I mean, he's completely sold on it. And every week I go to his office to be worked on. Every week, without exception, he brings up the teachings and the practices and the traditions of his church group. Now, a part of me, just to be frank, gets tired of hearing it. However, it's like, well, if I'm here, that's what he's going to talk about. So if nothing else, I just need to lie here on the table and maybe I can learn something the way he thinks. Maybe I can learn something here, something there, and maybe it will give me more background information. And I brought up a topic to him. Every so often, I will bring up something to sort of tweak him. Quite frankly, I sort of get tired of him just trying to sell me his religion. And I think, in part, that's what he's trying to do. I think he would love to convert me from whatever I am. He doesn't really understand what I am. And to become someone who follows his church group. Well, folks, that's not going to happen. And Don, if I ever do that, please get my gun and shoot me before I totally disqualify myself from eternal life. And I brought up to him that I said, Fred, have you ever noticed how different groups, different religious groups, so many of them have their little uniforms, their little signs and symbols and ways and manners to let you know who they are. Now you think about it. Jewish people, the men wear their yarmulke quite often. Mainstream Christians, they love to wear their crosses as though there's something holy in that cross. I don't know exactly why they do that as much as they do. I told them, I said, you know, some people, they wear their crosses or their earrings are in the shape of a cross or have the cross emblem. I know many young men at the gym who have tattoos somewhere on their arms or their legs a cross that's been inked into their flesh. Think about the Pentecostals. You can spot a Pentecostal woman 100 yards away. The hair up in a bun, the long skirts, they're often denim, I don't know why. And quite often you can spot Pentecostal men because they dress up like peacocks. Want everybody to see them. And then you get some Protestant minister types, pastors, that have to wear their black material, and then they have this little white collar. Now, why do they do that? It's a sign. I'm a pastor. I'm a reverend. Can't you see? I'm wearing my collar. Is there something holy about that collar? Does that collar have special powers that give them spiritual authority or wisdom or protects them from demons? I don't know. Well, I didn't even get to Fred's church, but I already made him uncomfortable. And he immediately leaps into the conversation, takes it away from me, and starts defending why the people of his church group, why the leaders, both the men and the women, why they dress up the way they do. Because you can spot these people from 100 yards away. Why do they feel compelled to do these things? And think about what Jesus said. Verse 5 again. All their works, everything they do is to be seen of men. I'm amazed that I'm an umpire, been an umpire for 62 years. I'm amazed at how many players will come up to the home plate, they're a hitter, and they'll make the sign of the cross on their forehead, or using their chest, their forehead and their chest. Many of these players will take their bat, and down in the dust and the dirt near home plate, they will with their bat, they will make the sign of a cross. Now, Don, I got a question for you. I don't think you're real experienced about athletics, but I'm sure you've been around some. Do you think God Almighty and Jesus Christ looked down from their throne and say, well, look at that player there. They just made the sign of the cross in the dirt. I think I'm going to bless them with a home run. Do you think that happens?
No.
No, I don't. I don't. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe sometimes I'll find out and I say, whoops. I thought I knew, but I guess I didn't. But why do people do these things to be seen of men? Just in your own private life, I'm going to ask you to do something this coming week. Especially if you get out and mix with different types of people in public. Maybe you go to Walmart, or you go to the grocery store, or you go to your church group. Just open your eyes and observe how many people do these, in my opinion, silly little things to be noticed, to be seen of men. I'm going to say to you folks that the vast majority of people who go to church, they do it to be seen of men. Baptists are notorious for carrying around huge Bibles. Now, the Bible I have in front of me, is relatively small. It's probably 6 inches by 8.5 inches. But I've driven by Baptist churches on a Sunday morning, and the Bibles they're carrying are gigantic. You know, they almost need one of those little carts that have the rollers on them, like you might be going to the airport and you pack all your stuff. They probably would be more comfortable if they could just roll that with them. But if they did that, no one would see their Bible. The whole purpose is to have that Bible seen. Look at me. I'm a genuine Bible thumper. Now, am I being a little sarcastic? Yeah. Does all of that irritate me? To be honest with you, yes, it does. Guess what? It irritated Jesus Christ too. So I'm not the first one who's become irritated over this. Let me check my time. Okay, I can still talk a bit. He talked about how they make broad their phylacteries. The phylactery was, I've often used the comparison of a Boy Scout merit badge. So once upon a time when I was much younger and had more hair and a much smaller waistline, I was a Boy Scout. In fact, I was an Eagle Scout. Quah, quah. I'm just joking. Yeah, I was an Eagle Scout. And a part of being an Eagle Scout was to earn different merit badges. And then after you got enough together, you had this sash that hung over one shoulder and went down to your side. And hopefully your mother would sew them on to the sash. And you could show up at some scouting gathering showing off all of your merit badges. And if you got enough of them and did other things, jumped through the hoops, you finally got to be called an Eagle Scout. Well, people get quite vain over things like that. And that's all this is that Jesus is describing. It's religious vanity. The word vanity means worthlessness. You know, Solomon was fond of saying, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He said that a lot back in the book of Ecclesiastes. Worthlessness. Worthlessness, just to be seen of men. Using another non-religious example, I go to the gym as often as I can. I need to. As I said last week, my legs, the strength of my legs have just greatly reduced here in the last few years, especially the last decade. I go to the gym so that I can have more strength in my legs and functionality. I want to be able to climb stairs like a normal person again. I want to be able to stand up from a chair like a normal person does. If I were to fall down, I want to be able to get back up on my feet and not have to call Don to say, can you come over here and help pick me up? Has that ever happened before, Don?
Oh, a few times.
A few times, okay. Yeah, I have some functionality in mind. But folks, I tell you, if you want to see some vain people, go to the gym I go to. Now, I used to go to a gym on the other part of town, and as I've said many times when I was in there, I thought I was on a geriatrics ward. You know, there might be some guy 85, 90 years of age walking around the track using his walker or his cane. And one guy used to do laps in a wheelchair. But the gym I go to now, As I said last week, the average age was from about 20 to 25. Now, there are younger people and there are some older people, but that's where most of them would lie in between, 18 to 25. And if those fellows sprout a few muscles, they want the whole world to see them. They want everybody in that gym to see them. Okay, the vanity of youth. But why do they do it? To be seen of men. They make large their phylacteries. They enlarge the borders of their garments. They're fixing up their clothing to look more spiritual or more religious. They love the uppermost rooms at the feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues. So they want to, I remember ever so often throughout the last 10, 20 years, I've gone through my channels on my television set, and Jimmy Swaggart and his church service would come on my television. And I noticed, if you remember, as you looked at the stage, there was the pulpit from which people speak. They had the singers behind the pulpit. They had a piano off to the left and some other band members, like maybe a saxophone, guitars. And then off to the right, all by themselves, they had a number of seats. And Jimmy and his wife would sit there, and often two of their sons, and maybe 2, 3, 4 other important people, or as my principal out in Arizona used to say, some impotent people. They wanted that chief seat. They wanted to be known as we're special. If you don't believe us, look at where we're sitting. We got the chief seats. Verse 7, and greetings in the markets, and they love to be called of men rabbi, rabbi, which means to be teacher. You know, they wanted everyone to know who they were. And, you know, many of the Pharisees wore these strange contraptions on top of their head. The number one, it made them look taller. And number two, it identified them as being a religious leader. Ooh, to be seen of men. Verse 8, but be not called rabbi, for only one is your master, that is Christ, and all of you are simply brothers and sisters. And call no man your father upon the earth. Oh my, what do the Catholics do with that verse? Do they just take a Sharpie and just scratch it out? Because you all know, I know, everyone knows, they call their priests father. Father this, father that. And then when you get around to the Pope, they don't just call him Father. Don, do you know what they call him?
Holy Father.
Holy Father. Wow. Now, folks, I don't mean to be too crude, but I'll bet you once or twice a day he has to sit on a toilet and poop, just like all of us. I mean, really, just how holy is he? Can he walk on water? I don't think so. I've never seen one. Jesus Christ could. Sometimes they call him the vicar of Christ. That phrase meaning he is in the place of, he's the substitute for Jesus Christ. I don't want to substitute for Jesus Christ. If I'm going to pray, I want to pray to Jesus Christ. If I'm going to confess my sins, I'm not going to confess to a priest. I'm going to confess my sins to Jesus Christ, who is the Savior, who is the only one who has the authority to forgive my friends, my sins, and to set me on the right path. I think you know what I'm saying. But like it said there, call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be you called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. Verse 11, but he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. How many leading religious people really act like they're your servant? But to some degree or another, they all want to have this air of authority about them. That's why some of them wear all of their robes and things around their neck, or the weird fancy head things on top of their head. They want to be noticed as being in charge. They want to be seen of men. He says in verse 12, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. For all those people that want to act like proud peacocks, walking around, strutting around, someday they will be brought down very low. And the truly humble people, which means submissive to God Almighty and Jesus Christ, someday they will be elevated. There are some ministerial people that I know. And I hope this is a bit of a spiritual fantasy. I hope that sometime in the future, in the kingdom, that I might be in charge of re-educating them. And Don, I have a job for some of them.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh. You know what it is?
What?
Cleaning out the horse manure in the barns. I think that would be a fitting job for them. Oh, why are you making us clean up all this poop? Because you've been pooping on human beings your entire human existence. You have lied to them, you have deceived them, you have misled them, you have confused them, you have put a stumbling block in front of them. You made it so it was almost impossible for them to someday learn the truth. And because of their lies and deceptions, some of those people might very well lose out on eternal life, which means it's a type of murder. Well, let me check the time again.
You got about a minute and a half.
I got a minute and a half?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Don is right. Well, real quick, a few verses over, he says to them, how can you escape the damnation of Gehenna fire? That's just about as direct as you can get. How can you escape? You vipers, you snakes in the grass, you hypocrites. Well, I need to end there because we're literally, if I don't, we're going to go into the next section. So friends, I love you. I hope you listen. I hope you learn. I hope you come back. Until next week, goodbye, my friends.